Hello and welcome to a free preview of Pulse Check, a special Quwa podcast dedicated to unpacking the structural forces behind Pakistan's national security policy making. In each episode, we bring together analysts and experts to examine the decisions and dynamics shaping Pakistan's defense strategy. I'm your host, Bilal Khan, and this is Pulse Check. So, this sort of bleeds into the next part of my discussion here, but this gets into the conversation of striking the balance between being a fighting force and managing industrial interests. So when we juxtapose what the PAF is going through with the JF-17 to what India is going through with the Tejas, like in some levels, at a very high level, macro level, you could actually argue both sides are having trouble, but very different troubles. And those sort of both stem from very different contexts. So, for example, we've already covered on the PAF side, you're a fighting force. And then as a fighting force, you went with the most pragmatic, simple, straightforward decision, delegate all the development work to China. You basically help fund Chinese development progress. In return, you get a fighter. It's a fair deal. But when it comes to the more complex integration work, you basically now have a lot of sunk cost problems that you have to sort of now basically deal with. On the Indian side, I think we can now genuinely argue that the bulk of India's military, at least their aircraft programs, have been driven by industrial interests. Now, as a result of having a very industrial interest first approach, definitely you have swollen your bureaucracy. There are a lot of internal government players. That's 100% true. But I think since they started licensed manufacturing their first fighter planes, you can definitely argue that they've built an aerospace industry. They have a lot of players. You definitely have, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. You have a growing ecosystem of private sub-assembly upstream suppliers. So you have a lot of people who have a stake in the program. All these people will definitely want the IAF to buy Tejas fighters. However, the IAF, given their environment, on the one hand, they have to basically level up to fight China, or at least contest against China, deter them. But at the same time, whatever advantages China has developed for itself, they tend to go and flow into Pakistan, which again creates like this weird, that you can never sort of shake Pakistan, and at the same time, there's that risk that China can just cork the taps open on Pakistan and make it even a bigger threat by releasing more sensitive technology. So the IF has to balance this out, and the IF right now wants Rafale fighter planes. However, the Indian industrial side, the bureaucracy, they're like, hey, no, we want technology transfer, we want localization, we want access to the source codes. And all the IAF is hearing is delay, stall negotiation problems. And I think when I look at these two, I kind of see them as extremes, because I think there should be a middle ground somewhere. And I'd like to know from you, like, because you're an engineer and you work in the industry, you've seen other examples, right, around the world. Is there a middle ground first? And if there is, what would it look like?
So I know I keep repeating this, but I think the example that I would go to is Turkey or Turkey, right? And what is that middle ground? Um, so what they did, and this is something I've repeated very often, they didn't start. So they didn't start with like what India did, right? Or what Pakistan did. They didn't go and say, we're going to make our own fighter jet. That's entirely the wrong approach. Because what you really want to do is have the ecosystem that produces the inputs that would eventually go into your fighter jet, right? So let's look at what Turkey did. They started manufacturing large parts of the F-16, right? And what that means is and the result of that was slowly but surely, they built up an industry around industrial ecosystem around that program that would supply inputs to that program, right? So when they started that program on day one, that they were probably getting a lot of the inputs from the US, right? As if they weren't making everything themselves. But today they're doing, what's it called? The old school program, right? So that's the progress that they've made on the F-16, right? So you have to be incremental, and you have to think about what your industry, like how the industry actually flows. So what India is doing is sort of doing it backwards, right? So they're like, we're going to make this aircraft. What do we need for that? That's thinking about this backwards. What you need to do is, we eventually want to make we have some nebulous idea of, making or being an aerospace manufacturer. What are the inputs that we need to have to be able to do that? So they took like a foreign design. They didn't focus on the design work. They made sure that, the industrial inputs were there. So when they actually went to an original design with like a Horrid Kush or a Horrid Jet or a TFX, they actually had the inputs, right? So let's look at Pakistan, right? So let's suppose Azam was successful, right? So mm, let's imagine a situation where PF has a great design for the Azam, right? It's 2021 and PF has a wonderful design for the Azam. But the problem is there is no aerospace industry in Pakistan. So how are they going to manufacture this aircraft in Pakistan? Where are they going to get those inputs? You can't just start a program like that, right? Let's go to India, right? And with India, let's say they have like a very successful design, but they're going to fix. So because they're only, again, they've done it backwards, just like the PF. They just figured out how to design, but now they're going to realize, we don't have the correct engines for it, or we don't have the correct, landing gears for this, or and then they're going to have delays, and then the, the unique problem, or one of the problems with them is their Air Force doesn't have buy-in into their industrial programs, and there needs to be a little bit of that as well. So again, I'll go back to Turkey and how they solved that program. First, they focused on the F-16, which they knew the Air Force wanted, right? And the Air Force had. So they would definitely get buy-in. So it's very important to get buy-in, right? And then with each progressive like program that they did, they made sure that was something that the Air Force wanted, and they made sure that it would buy, right? So then go ahead and start with something like the Tejas, right? So they started with the Orkut. It's a propeller powered trainer, right? So they focused on that requirement. So, and they realized there's an export market for that as well and all that stuff. But they made sure, the fighting force that they were primarily designing this thing for had a buy-in. So I really feel like, Turkey does a lot of things that you can learn from because we have the benefit of hindsight and are able to see the results of the possibly, you know, difficult and nonsense seeming decisions that they made 20 years ago now, right? Or 4 years ago now, right? Because if you were in like the 90s, maybe the PF and the DRDO were like, oh, Turkey is making a stupid mistake, making the F-16s, they should make their own aircraft or something, right? But now you can see the advantage of doing that. It helped create the ecosystem that facilitates designs that are original now.
So while you were talking about Turkey, I was also thinking that there might be other middle ground examples as well, and two have come to mind. I'll start with the less obvious one, and that was South Africa. So back in the 70s and 80s, what was interesting was that South Africa and Pakistan were both inducting, the Mirage 3 and the 5 based platforms, basically. South Africa went further with the Mirage F1 as well. And also the PAF had also looked at the Mirage F1 in the 70s at the time as well, but I think funding and some other issues basically scuttled that entire approach. That being said, what was interesting to me was that both South Africa and Pakistan around this time, they were basically, because they were inducting relatively large numbers of Mirages, they were basically tuning their domestic bases to support them better. So with the PAF, you had basically the establishment of the Mirage rebuild factory, which played a very instrumental role in keeping those fighter planes active for, well past their, intended airframe lives. But within South Africa, they started going a step further. So they had built their own Mirage rebuild factory, but when the sanctions hit, the South African Air Force was not able to procure new fighter planes from the market, around the mid 70s to through the 80s, and this basically required the South African government to tell its own state-owned equivalents of PAC, what have you. Basically, it was Atlas Aerospace. to, hey, you need to go out and figure out how we can maintain these fighters and modernize them, right? And this led to them basically, it wasn't as if they were, just building that industry and sort of working based on that. It was more like they had the maintenance side, and using that as the groundwork, they started investing in the R&D on top of that directly. So as opposed to what the PAF tried to do with Azam, which was basically, you basically, in software engineering, you have basically, because they're refactoring the code base. So they tried refactoring the code base and go to a next generation fighter aircraft. But when time came to like connect that code base, so to speak, the design to the industrial side, there's no industrial side, there's no hardware element to basically pump it out. Whereas what the Indians might be doing is basically they're thinking in a more, I want my money's worth kind of mentality, where they're thinking, hey, we're going to spend $50 billion. I want that $50 billion to give me the means to go and build this fighter plane. And I'm expecting the seller to go and teach me how to do it, give me the technology, and so on and so forth. And that ends up with, delayed negotiations and what have you. But what South Africa did was that they looked at what they had. They had the Mirage series. And from there, they said, okay, what are the inputs that our industry can make right now, which is going to your point. So they had like some form of alloys industry. They had some form of integration and software, like electronics integration work happening already. And then on top of that, they started investing in areas like, okay, we need to know how to modify certain parts of this airframe. We need to know how to rebuild and remanufacture certain, the stabilizers, the front fuselage, and what have you. We need to invest in the new design MOs. We need to invest in building the CNCs and the tooling and all that for that stuff as well. And they sort of channeled their investment around the Mirage platform, which then resulted in the Cheetah multi-role fighter, which helped them through the 90s. And I feel like for me, like for the PFs, it's a bit of a hindsight tragedy where we had a very similar foundation. In the 70s, we even had an industrial base. Yes, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto nationalized it, but it was still functional. I mean, we're talking about 1 year after the nationalization, so it was still a functioning industry. So, and the same industry was used to basically help develop our nuclear weapons. So, I mean, the point being that it was industrially capable. And there's this opportunity in the 70s and 80s, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, where the French were ready to move on from the Mirage 3 and 5, where we could have just bought whatever they had in relation to that platform and done what South Africa did in developing our own, let's say like a, 3.5 early fourth generation variant of it, based on a clean sheet platform, based on new airframes, but on a clean sheet platform on a simpler foundation at a time where we could have accessed alloy, expertise regarding alloys and all this stuff much sooner. That's one example. The other one, just quickly, is China. And China, for a long time, they were basically had to kind of basically build new F7s, new MiG-21s. But around that, again, what they used to do was, because, and I think they had this advantage of scale and a lot of funding because they're a big country, basically. But they used to do a lot of experimentation work. So if you look into Chinese history through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they had a lot of these experimental projects which allowed their R&D people to learn a lot of the more advanced aerospace stuff. So when the time came to start doing the J-10, they had like armies of engineers and scientists and facilities ready to go. So that's I think contingent on you having a lot of skill. Maybe that's more applicable to the Indian side of the equation because they might have more money and stuff. So I just want to get your thoughts on that, basically.
Um, those are two great examples that I honestly didn't think of, and I will just tie those two examples with my example again with like a common thread that I see. They all started with existing designs, right? So they didn't get up one day and say, we're going to design our own aircraft. Like South Africa did Mirages, right? China did F6s, F7s, like all those, their entire family. Like they even copied the flanker series, right? So they were doing that so late into the game. And I don't want to say copy because I know I said that, but what I mean is they're basically learning how an aircraft is designed, how it's manufactured, what those decisions are. There are hundreds of thousands of decisions and, things that go into such a thing that you cannot possibly know. They're nowhere in any kind of publication and nobody will tell you. These are things that you need to learn. So the best way to learn it is by taking an existing platform and figuring out the decisions behind that or having someone tell you those, right? So that's what China and Turkey and South Africa did. And that's something that, let's say Pakistan did not do with us, right? Or India did not do with Tejas. So that's one of the things.
So now to close the loop back to how we started this discussion, I think based on what we've discussed, at one level, there is again another opportunity for the PEF to sort of do the right thing, to take the middle ground through the JF-17. So, as you noted, we don't have total capacity for the JF-17 in the sense that we don't produce all of it. But even at the downstream level, we don't manufacture all of it. We have to import, other parts of the airframe from China. Obviously, the engine currently comes from Russia. In the future, it'll probably come from China. That's another thing. But again, those are things you cannot really control and negotiate at the moment. However, it is true that it is the mainstay fighter of the PAF. It's the most numerous fighter aircraft. You have basically invested in quite a bit of capacity within the PAF to maintain and operate, and even to an extent, however limited, integrate subsystems and munitions to it. So if you were to take the middle ground approach, let's say, I think the middle ground approach starts again, one of the underlying themes of this podcast series is, structural stuff, policy. It starts with policy, right? It starts at someone coming in within the PAF and saying, look, we it's true that we have to be a fighting force. It's true that we have limited funding and time, but we need to start thinking at an industrial level as well. So we need to bring in the industrial side of the equation into this within rules, within a framework, in order to get to that next stage where, because if we don't deal with this correctly, we are going to end up in this like loop of diminishing returns. So right now we're able to get 200 JF-17s, whatever, which is good. The next stage, we're going to depend on China. We're going to get fewer fighters. The next stage, we're going to depend on whoever else, the Chinese or the Turks. We're going to get fewer fighters, and our capability is going to get weakened and weakened, and our economy is not getting better. There's a disconnect here. So I think at Turkey, China, you have this awareness at both sides, right? With different manifestations. I think the closest analogous example I can think of really is Turkey at this moment to what Pakistan did, because they had very similar grounding, and they came from a situation where they were not industrialized to becoming industrialized. So I think that's a really good sort of example to follow, although there are caveats. We don't have nearly as much access to, the wider market of tooling and instrumentation. However, I think the regime that sort of restricted us from having that, the US led order, so to speak, I think that is evolving now, where that might not be as much of an issue in the long run, especially if it means from America's standpoint at a very high level that, hey, if more independent, self-sufficient countries form up, there'll be less going to China, for example. That could be one rationale. Because if you look at the recent U.S.-Saudi nuclear agreement that they're drafting up, it is so loose, which is hilarious. Like even the Democrats are saying, like, this is setting the Saudis up for a nuclear weapon. Do you guys not realize this? So I think maybe the Americans themselves are sort of evolving in that mentality there. So I think at this level, at a policy level, you would want the PEF to do the most controversial thing ever. And the most controversial thing, believe it or not, is not bring in civilian diplomats or civilian bureaucrats. That's not that's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is getting over whatever issues they have with NESCOM and working with NESCOM. I think that's really where, because NESCOM is the big industrial player. There's NESCOM and I would say PAEC, the Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission. Those are two big industrial players in Pakistan, if you think about it. Obviously, PAEC is not relevant to this, so put that to the side. It's really NESCOM. You need to bring some people from within NESCOM. You need to sort of rebuild those linkages and synchronize on how do we get the industrial side going in a rational way. How do we potentially get to the point where we can manufacture all the JF-17 potentially without Chinese help in even doing it? Maybe they don't want to give us the critical tooling and equipments and what have you, and the molding and all that, for the molding system for us to do that, right? Maybe we want to improve some parts of the airframe in terms of the materials being used. Maybe we want to use different types of alloys to reduce the weight. Like there's so much potential there we have to look at. How do we get there? And I think that is the first step. Like, we can go into the whole engineering side of it, and that's just going to that's going to give us like 100-hour podcast, and that maybe we delve into too many national secrets. At the very beginning, we need the policy. What do you think about that? Like that issue?
So what you said made me think about so I just don't want to be a naysayer. I want to propose a solution. Like, what should Pakistan be doing? So I really think this is an opportunity for us. So hot take, but JF-17 is to Pakistan, but the ethics was to Turkey. So yeah, let me explain that. It's actually even better, right? Because Turkey had nowhere near those levels of input into the JF-17 that Pakistan has on the JF. They didn't have on the F-16 that Pakistan has on the JF-17, right? Yes, we didn't do the design work in Pakistan or qualification work in Pakistan, but we are the main operator, and we did set the requirements, and it is basically our aircraft in terms of design choices. Okay, so but that means we're 40 years behind where Turkey is. Yeah, sure. Why not? You have to start somewhere. You need to start yesterday, right? So whatever that day is. And I will say that because you're starting off with a better base than Turkey, right? So when they started with the F-16, they started off with a design that was, being made somewhere else. Now, one advantage that they did have was the scale of the F-16 program. So that is something that is missing for the GF-17, right? So the GF-17 isn't as widespread as the F-16, but you'll see it's sort of analogous. So let's pretend I'm an empowered Minister of Defense Production, right? So I'm not just like a rubber stamp person, and I actually have power. What would I do? Okay. So the first thing I would do, and this is something that we've talked about ad nauseum, is separate PAC from the PF. Right? It is so disadvantageous to have a fighting force manage an industrial production site or even a MRO site. Right? It makes no sense. And the PF proudly says, or at least it used to say, it's the only air force that makes an aircraft. That's not a good thing to say. That's not something to be proud of. That's a terrible. That's saying that our country cannot make aircraft. We have to, as a fighting force, have to go out and make our own aircraft. Right? So that's a terrible idea. So have PAC becomes something like the Turkish aerospace model, right? So it's privately, managed, owned, still owned by the BF, right? They need to own this. So it's kind of like what they're doing with NASTEP, but more industrial focused, right? Hire from anywhere, right? So you don't have this restriction of being, hiring into like a military controlled site. So it's much more restrictive to go into PAC, right? Than is to, let's say, go to NASDAQ, right? So that's step one. Now this place is going to hire aggressively from two places, right? So one is something that NASDAQ is already doing, which is hiring young people, straight out of college. The other kinds of people that it will hire for is from NESCOM. And I know you did mention NESCOM, and you said, maybe PF should collaborate with NESCOM, but NESCOM has its own issues that prevent it from, uh, being as fast paced as you need it to be. So, but we do have a lot of people with a lot of experience in those organizations, and they end up going to the UAE and abroad with that experience, and there's no place for them in Pakistan, right? Because there's a lot of people that actually want to lead those organizations. So you could make a place if you made like a semi-private PAC that would attract those people because nobody wants to leave their country, right? They would much rather stay, and if they can make a decent living and make decent work. So they would choose that over a job abroad, even if it pays less, right? So that's the other thing I would do, right? Now, the third thing I would actually push very hard for the second option that I gave for the JF-17 airframes, which is that we somehow get China to offload the entire production to Pakistan.
Thank you for listening. That concludes the preview. For the full episode, subscribe to Quwa Plus or Quwa Pro.